Okay, alright, deep breath. Just one more game before you can finally talk about Resident Evil 4. You can do this. Just one more week. Home stretch, Scr00bl0rd. Make it count. Okay. Resident Evil 0 is the prequel to the first Resident Evil. It came out for the GameCube the same year as the Resident Evil remake, and it uses the same engine. It didn't sell as well as the RE remake did, and is mostly, in my mind, associated with the hardcore fans of Resident Evil. This may have changed now, seeing as how Resident Evil 0 received an HD remaster a few years back and was bundled with the HD remaster of Resident Evil Remake, making it accessible to more people across a wide array of platforms. But for years, only my most hardcore of Resident Evil nerd friends had managed to finish it, and most anyone else either hadn't played it or only played it a bit and then got stumped or frustrated. For what seems like the longest time, people would always refer to it as the one with the train, right? Or that one where you have a partner, right? In conversation. Me, I always referred to it as the really hard one whenever pressed about it. I fit into the played a bit of it, got stumped and quit category. This was partly due to the fact I had to sneak play it when my parents weren't home, also partly because I see walkthroughs as admitting to the game that it beat me, so I spent most of my time wandering aimlessly. But mainly this has to be attributed to the fact that Resident Evil 0 is the most puzzle-heavy focused Resident Evil game I've ever played, and I wasn't a very bright child. When I say this game is puzzle-focused, I mean the entire thing is basically nothing but puzzles. I said last week in my Code Veronica review that I really liked it because it was less focused on combat and more puzzle and world design. Well, Resident Evil 0 definitely follows suit and then some, only now having the absolutely stunning RE Remake engine to run on. I will never ever get tired of the atmosphere that Remake and 0 bring to the table. The way they use the GameCube's superior hardware to really polish up those pre-rendered backgrounds, combined with the gorgeous lighting and a really nice character modeling job. Both of these games still hold up visually on the original hardware almost 20 years after the fact, and that's a true feat in and of itself. So how do I feel about Resident Evil 0 after having finally finished it some 15 years later after taking a shot at it? Well, to be honest, I'm not actually quite sure yet. I am keeping in mind that this is the 5th Resident Evil game I've played in 5 weeks, and I'm starting to get that too much of a good thing feeling. On top of already being so excited to review Resident Evil 4 that I've kind of already mentally moved on to that and found myself sort of checked out with Resident Evil 0 and sort of going through the motions. I've set myself into a routine with these games over the last several weeks where I approach them from the same angle every time. First off, I get from game start to the first save point using as little items and losing the least amount of health I can. If I was in a caution or a danger state by that first save point, I would then reset the game and do it over again until I wasn't, and only then would I save. Next, I would go explore, and it would go one of two ways. One, I would solve a big puzzle or two while taking little to no damage and using my resources efficiently on my first try. Since saves are limited in these games, I would have to do really well my first time going through something in order to use a save. Two, I would explore and eventually get to a point where I've taken too much damage and used too many items to use a save, so I'll just continue to explore until I solve a big puzzle or eventually die, at which point I'll reset the game and do it until I did it well enough to warrant a save. Finally, repeat until game is completed. Getting into this routine has made it harder for me to appreciate certain aspects of some of the games I've played in this marathon in retrospect, because falling into this pattern eventually means mundanity, and except for major cutscenes, I was listening to Bo Burnham's Inside or that Fake Doctors Real Friends podcast with Zach Braff and Donald Faison going through each episode of Scrubs individually, both of which I highly recommend, by the way. As good as they are, however, it meant that I wasn't taking the time to appreciate the atmosphere as much, and the game lost most of its suspense for me. I did keep the game volume on, just low, so I did pick up on some of it, and it does have some really nice touches. For instance, there's this music that starts off with a suspenseful noir jazz style piano sting that plays the instant when you walk into a room that has a puzzle in it, and I jump the first time it happens. After this, however, if you walk into a room with something major hidden in it, the game makes that noise and you know to explore that room more. It's a nice touch. Plus, in the later parts of the game, you encounter these regenerator type enemies that make this disgusting squishing sound whenever they walk, and you know they're in the room because there's this really intense music that's playing and it gets your heart racing. It's great. Still, I think this game might have been a little more intimidating if I hadn't felt the need to break up the monotony of playing another Resident Evil game by listening to something else. Think of it like playing Fallout with the radio on versus the radio off. This game works a little bit differently, as I'm sure that most people are familiar. Instead of being a single-person struggle through a nightmare like most other Resident Evil games, you instead play as two characters simultaneously throughout the game. Rebecca Chambers and Billy Corgan or something. I can't remember. You can switch off whichever one you're controlling and have your partner follow you, stay behind, or be attacking and or not attacking, all of which are used to solve puzzles. Billy Corgan can take more damage than Rebecca can and carries the lighter, while Rebecca is the only one that can mix herbs and interact with certain puzzle items. There are no item boxes in this game, and you have to use the partner that's with you to swap inventory items with. This means that anything you don't need at that particular moment will be left behind, usually next to where your main save point is. And also that you'll need to backtrack to bring certain things with you or pick up a puzzle item you can't carry because your inventory was full when you found it. This is great because it does add a lot to the challenge and helps bring another layer of puzzle by removing one thing and forcing you to decide what stuff is really important. However, this sucks because it means that there's lots and lots and lots of running through the same room and following the same paths just to get back to where you left an item you found earlier in the game that fits into a later puzzle. Most of the footage I caught ended up being of the main hall area because I was constantly running back and forth between it while trying to get even the simplest stuff done. It adds a lot of time to the game that most other Resident Evil games wouldn't require. I honestly can't tell if this is a genius way to extend the lifespan of the game by engaging the fanbase with a unique challenge involving twisting a core mechanic, or if this is just them trying to pad out the game and make it not just feel like Resident Evil Remake, the prequel one we threw together. The most disappointing thing about Resident Evil 0 to me is its world map. The game starts out strong with being on a train and having to work with Billy Corgan to get it stopped before crashing. Unfortunately, that part's over in an hour and we find ourselves in the Umbrella Research Center, which is connected to the mansion from Resident Evil 1 for plot's sake. And from there, it immediately falls back into the same type of world design as Resident Evil Remake. Same colors, same mansion-like environment, same boss battle with giant bugs, same annoying enemies that completely wreck your shit, and they cram way too many of them into tight spaces when you need to get through on a time limit. Except this time, they made that enemy much smaller and faster so they can cram more of them into a hallway than usual. Other than a handful of times though, the combat is probably the most non-existent of any game in this series. Other than a few bosses, all of which you'll be given more than enough ammo for right beforehand, there's a minimal amount of zombies, and most harder enemies you'll just run around unless they're blocking a very important hallway you'll need to be in and out of often. I lost track of my points a bit there, but what I'm getting at is that this is a bit of a downgrade on the level design front coming out of Code Veronica. Resident Evil 0 is basically train, research facility, lab, and sewer level. I know that's a bit of an exaggeration that makes it sound slightly more boring than it actually is, but the fact that I'm putting it in the same category as boring should really tell you something. Resident Evil Code Veronica had a really well-designed, intuitive open-world map design that felt engaging and claustrophobic without limiting its scope or its creativity. The palace is essentially connected to the airport by a couple of doors, but you have to spin a captain's wheel to unlock a submarine to take you there. It had those little touches that made it a very fresh entry into the Resident Evil franchise, whereas Resident Evil 0 just feels like Resident Evil Remake with a couple of gimmicks thrown in. Also, some of the puzzles the game throws at you are just ridiculous. Sometimes in the sense of how convoluted they are, but also there's a couple of times where you have to separate the two characters to different areas in order to solve a puzzle. And if you send the wrong person on a couple of these puzzles, then the game will actually punish you by making the puzzle even harder to solve. You wouldn't know this on a first playthrough, and it really came to a head during one late game puzzle because I sent the wrong character to the floor above me so I could send items back and forth across both floors to solve one big puzzle, which led to me getting completely lost and confused for several hours because I didn't know that this decision required me to backtrack to an earlier part of the game to use something I didn't even know was there. If I would have sent the other character, however, both of the items I needed were on the higher floor and I would have been able to interact with them and solve the puzzle easily. That's a beginner's trap and it's infuriating. Out of all the Resident Evil games I played, this one has been the hardest just on puzzles alone. I can deal with the combat in these games without getting stuck, but a lot of these puzzles threw me for a loop. In a good way most of the time, but the lower points can get really exhausting. Boss fights in this game really suck too. A lot of them are clunky in a Silent Hill kind of way, except clearly done without the intention of adding fear and anxiety because none of the combat in this game is scary in the slightest. There's one boss fight in a church later on that's absolutely awful, and you'll find yourself wasting a lot of ammo for certain weapons because the aim sucks and the boss swerves around you and fucks with you while throwing minions at you that your character wants to automatically lock onto, and it sucks. The first one is fine in my opinion because mostly it isn't much of a hassle. In fact, most of the difficulty in the boss fights in this game game mostly come down to walking into a boss room for the first time and then resetting so I can go take items I need for a boss. And after that, I can only think of one boss that actually killed me more than once. So I guess all that would be the reason why I'm very lukewarm on this one. It's not bad at all, but it's not as polished or as engaging as other Resident Evil games in the series, either now or back when it was released. Chances are, if you're a huge Resident Evil fan, you've already played this, but if you're watching this and haven't, then I definitely consider how big of a Resident Evil fan you are before spending the money.
Later, Nick!